Today we're going to talk about my favorite subject, and probably yours as well, VA math, and why your ratings just don't add up. Frequent question we get, and probably one of the most commonly searched questions on the internet about VA disability, is why don't my VA ratings add up? And I once had a colleague of mine say that they are 280% VA disabled, which obviously doesn't make a whole lot of sense. But if you've noticed, if you have multiple ratings, if you're a veteran who has multiple disability ratings, the numbers just don't quite add up the same way that they would if you were just adding them together. So for instance, you might wonder, well, I have two 50% ratings. Why don't I have a 100% disability rating? Because 50 plus 50 is 100, correct? Here's a little bit of background on this. The way the VA looks at this, and again, I'm not defending this system or whether it's a good system or a bad system, but I am just going to lay it out there about how VA ratings are calculated, how they're added together, and some of the thought process as to why this is. The VA started with this concept of, let's say a person is 100% non-disabled. If you're 30% disabled, that means that you're 70% not disabled. Makes sense, right? So any additional disability on top of that would only be eating into that non-disabled portion. Here's the example that I like to use. Let's say you're going to walk to the grocery store, and the grocery store is 1 mile away from your house. And you're going to say, well, I only want to walk halfway there. You get on your shoes and you walk halfway there, and you've walked half a mile and stop. If you say, well, I'm going to walk another halfway there, you're actually not walking the rest of the way. You're only walking half of the remaining half of the distance you have to travel. So now you are only 0.75 miles into your journey, and you still have 0.25 miles or a quarter of the way to go. Taking it a step further, say, well, I am a quarter of a mile away. I'm going to walk half the way there. You're only going to get 0.125 of the way there in total, or 0.125 miles. So now you are 87.5% of the way to your goal. You still haven't reached 100%, even though you've closed from 1 mile to half a mile to 3/4 of a mile to 0.875 miles, going half the distance remaining each time. You're still not all the way there. So how does this apply to VA disability ratings, and how do you calculate them? I would use one of the handy dandy online calculators you can find, and we're going to put one on the Guidon Law's website. We're developing that as we speak. By the time you watch this, it may already be live, but we're working on that. You can plug in your ratings and it'll spit out the number on the other end. But you can also do it on paper. The way to do this is you want to find the VA's combined ratings table, which is linked down below. And that combined ratings table is a chart that'll help you go through the process. First thing you want to do is you want to line up the disability ratings from start to finish based on how big they are. So let's say you have a 50% rating for sleep apnea, a 30% rating for migraines, and 10% rating for tinnitus or tinnitus. First thing you do is you take your 50% rating, and that's what you start with. You have 50% left to get to 100. So you take 30% of that 50%. 30% of that 50% is about 15%, and you add that to the 50%. So now you're at 65%. Then you take your tinnitus, and you have 35% of the way to go to get to 100%. So you add 10% of 35 is 3.5, and now you're up to 68.5, round up to 70, so you're 70% disabled. You can actually do this on the combined ratings table by following along as you go with your finger. First, you're going to go along to the 50% rating at the top of the column. That's that horizontal axis. And then you're going to say you're going to add that 30%. You're going to follow along the far left side. 30%, go down the 50% column, and you land on 65. Well, now you start at 65. Start on that left-hand side, scroll all the way down, it's a couple pages, and you want to add 10% to that. You add 10%, and now you're at 69 on that table in that first column. Let's do another one. Let's say you have 70% for a mental health condition. You have 30% for migraines. You have 10% for your cervical spine, and 10% for your lumbar spine, and 10% for tinnitus. So it's lined up as 70, 30, 10, 10, 10. So you're going to start by going down the table to 70% and adding your 30%, which gets you to 79%. You keep going down the table to 79, and you go add your 10% in there to 81. Go down to 81, add your 10%, and now you're at 83. You add your 10% to 83, and now you're at 85. 85 rounds up to 90. So let's say you've got that 50% rating, if you're not doing the math by hand and you want to use the combined ratings table. You want to start off in the vertical column and scroll down on this vertical column till you hit 50%, and then add your 30%, which gets you 65. You then scroll down to 65 and you add your 10, which gets you to 69. If you were adding a 20, you'd be at 72, but we're adding a 10. So now you're at 69. But let's add another, since that rounds up to 70, but let's add another 10% rating. If you add another 10% rating, you're only at 72. 72 still rounds down to 70. Again, VA numbers are only rounded to the 10. So if you are at a combined rating of 65%, it rounds up to 70. If you add another 10% rating, it's still probably only going to be 70. And if you had another 10% rating, it's still only going to be 70 because you haven't gotten to that next number to round up. So that's the basics. Again, you can use the combined ratings table to get an idea, or you can use one of the online calculators to add this up. Now let's talk about the bilateral factor. The bilateral factor is confusing because it actually throws a whole wrench into this already very difficult calculation. By very difficult, I mean it takes a little bit of pen and paper to go through everything. The bilateral factor takes every condition for which could be bilateral. For instance, if you have both right and left leg problems, maybe it's a right knee and a left ankle, or a right shoulder and left shoulder, and you run that through a special calculation. You kind of put those aside and run them through their own calculation. So let's say you have two shoulder ratings at 20% each. You actually take those two shoulder ratings at 20% each, you run them on the table. Start on the left column, 20 plus 20 equals 36. But the bilateral factor actually adds 10% of that 36 onto that rating. So now you're at 39.6. Gets even more complicated than that though if you have multiple other conditions. Now oftentimes the bilateral factor won't even make a difference, but let's say you have you wouldn't have two left shoulder problems. You have a left shoulder and a right shoulder problem at 20% each, and a right knee and a left knee problem. So again, you add your right knee and your left knee, and your right shoulder and your left shoulder. Right shoulder's at 20, your left shoulder's at 20, gets you to 36. Scroll down the table to 36. I have a 10% for the right knee is 42. I go down to 42 and I have a 10% for my left knee and I'm at 48. What I do is I add another 4.8 to that 48 for the bilateral factor. So now I'm at 52.8. Now, what do I do with that combined bilateral factor score? Again, I've taken all of my bilateral conditions out of the equation. Now let's say in addition to those conditions, the bilateral shoulder and bilateral knees, I also have 50% for PTSD and I have 30% for migraines. I have a 52.8 for all of my bilateral conditions. Let's round up to 53. So what I do is I start at 53 on the table and then I add my 50% for my PTSD. 53% on the table, add to 50% for my PTSD is 77. And if I have that 30, I scroll down to 77, adding that 30% for my headaches is 84. Which rounds down to 80. Again, kind of complicated stuff. This is why there are a ton of good online calculators, including the one that is either on the website by the time you're reviewing this or will be soon. It gets a little tricky, especially when you're adding the bilateral factor and ordering those up. But again, you start by ordering your ratings from biggest to smallest. You then take out any bilateral factors. You calculate the bilateral factor. You put the bilateral factor back in from biggest to smallest, if there's any to deal with. And then you work on the combined ratings table, or you can do it with pen and paper as I just showed you. Now, the VA usually gets this calculation right most of the time. In a couple of cases a couple years ago, they screwed up the bilateral factor. There were actually situations where adding the bilateral factor reduced your rating. But they've actually gone back and fixed that, we think. As I said, hopefully this clears up some of the VA math for you and some of the concept of why 2 plus 2 does not equal 4. It equals 3.6, which rounds up to 4 in VA math. Hope that was helpful. This will not be on the test, guys, but that's why we have calculators. Until next time, take care.